This is the expanded English language narrative of the Louisiana lesson. Given the length of your request, 6,000 words, I will provide the first major installment here, crafted with cinematic detail and emotional depth. We will move through the first 4 chapters of this confrontation. The Louisiana lesson. The Reckoning. Chapter 1. The atmosphere of a firing squad. The air inside the House Ethics Committee chamber was thick enough to choke a ghost. It wasn't just the heat of 400 bodies packed into a room designed for 300. It was the tension, a physical, vibrating weight that seemed to hum in the very floorboards of the Rayburn building. Outside, the Potomac was a slab of gray slate under a bruised Washington sky. But inside, the world was focused on a single mahogany table. Every camera in the Capitol was trained on that table. The lenses looked like the muzzles of rifles at a firing squad. At the center of it all sat Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. She was the picture of practiced composure. Her hijab perfectly pinned, her expression a mask of, "I've dealt with worse than you." Across from her sat Senator John Kennedy. He wasn't a member of this committee, but he had been invited as a constitutional expert, a move that sent shivers through the opposition. Kennedy didn't look like a man about to deliver a political execution. He looked like a man about to tell a story on a porch in Baton Rouge. He adjusted his spectacles, his fingers moving with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who knew he had all the time in the world and that his opponent had none. "Congresswoman Omar," Kennedy began. His voice was a thick, slow-moving syrup of a Louisiana drawl, stretching every vowel like taffy. "I'm just a simple country lawyer from Louisiana, and I'll be the first to admit, I'm not as smart as the folks who run this town. But I have some questions that have been keeps me up at night, and I suspect they're keeping a lot of other folks up too." He leaned forward, his elbows hitting the table with a soft thud that felt like a gavel. "I want you to think real careful before you answer," Kennedy said, his eyes narrowing, "because about 10 million Americans are watching right now, and they have very long memories." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the frantic scratching of reporters' pens. Kennedy opened a blue folder. Round 1 had begun. Chapter 2. Betty's $50 and the silver BMW. "Let's start with the money," Kennedy said, tapping the folder 3 times. "Because where I'm from, you can tell everything you need to know about a person by looking at where they get their money and how they spend it." He pulled out a single, wrinkled piece of paper. It looked like it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. "Congresswoman, this here is from a lady named Betty Henderson. She's 68 years old, a retired nurse from Duluth, Minnesota. Betty spent 40 years of her life wiping brows, changing bandages, and holding the hands of folks who were taking their last breaths. She's a good woman, a God-fearing woman." Kennedy held the paper up for the cameras. "Betty lives on Social Security, $1,500 a month. That's it. In Minnesota, that barely covers the heat and the groceries. But she saw your speeches. She heard you talk about fighting for the little guy. So, she took $50 money she probably needed for her blood pressure medicine, and she sent it to you. She wrote a note with it. 'Please use this to fight for us.'" Kennedy's voice dropped to a whisper that carried to the back of the room. "Do you know where that $50 went, ma'am?" Omar huffed, a sharp, defensive sound. "Senator, all campaign expenditures are fully disclosed under FEC guidelines. If you are suggesting, I ain't suggesting, I'm stating." Kennedy cut her off, his voice hardening like cooling iron. "That $50 didn't go to fight for Betty. It went to a consulting firm owned by your husband. It went toward the lease on a silver BMW. While Betty was eating canned soup to save money, your campaign was funneling $250,000 to your own household for strategic communications advice. Now, I'm just a country lawyer, But that sounds an awful lot like a legal way to pick a widow's pocket. He gestured to the third row of the gallery. Betty's here today, Congresswoman. She took the bus all the way from Duluth. Betty, stand up for a second. A small, frail woman with white hair stood up. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the seat in front of her. Look her in the eye, Kennedy commanded. Look at Betty and tell her that her $50 was best spent on your husband's car payments. Tell her that's the equity you talk about in your speeches. Omar wouldn't look. She stared at her notes. Her jaw clenched so tight the muscles in her neck stood out. The room was no longer a committee chamber. It was a confessional. Chapter 3. Muhammad's 12 Years of Silence. Kennedy didn't wait for her to recover. He flipped to a second folder. This one stuffed with immigration records and stamps from the Somali government. Let's talk about the system you call broken, Kennedy said. You say our borders are too hard to cross, that we aren't compassionate enough. I want to introduce you to Muhammad Hassan. A man in his 50s stood up in row 8. He wore a suit that was a size too big, bought specifically for this day. His face was a map of exhaustion and dignity. Muhammad came to America from Somalia as a legal refugee, Kennedy explained. He did everything the right way. He filled out every form. He paid every fee. He waited, and he waited. Muhammad, how long did it take you to bring your daughter here? 12 years, Muhammad said. His voice was thick with an accent, but clear as a bell. I missed her 8th birthday, her 10th, her 15th. I missed her childhood because I wanted to follow the laws of my new home. Kennedy walked toward the witness table. 12 years. Muhammad did it by the book. He didn't take shortcuts. He didn't creatively interpret the rules. But you, Congresswoman, your path was a bit more, shall we say, expedited? There are questions about your marriage history, about timelines that don't add up, about using the system to leapfrog over people like Muhammad. That is a baseless conspiracy theory, Omar snapped, her voice rising for the first time. It's a matter of record, Kennedy drawled. Muhammad's daughter is 20 years old now. She's sitting right next to him. She calls him Muhammad instead of Baba, because he was a stranger to her for over a decade. While you were playing the system to secure your own power, men like Muhammad were suffering because they were honest. You don't want to fix the system, Congresswoman. You just want to make sure the rules only apply to the people who aren't in the squad. Muhammad's daughter, Amina, began to sob. The sound was quiet, but in the hushed room, it sounded like a building collapsing. Kennedy let the sound fill the space for a long, uncomfortable minute. Chapter 4. Sarah Goldstein and the Red Paint. Now, let's talk about the weight of words, Kennedy said, his voice turning ice cold. He pulled out a photo of a classroom door. On it was a spray-painted swastika. This is Roosevelt High School in Minneapolis, Kennedy said, and this is Sarah Goldstein's classroom. Sarah, would you mind standing up? A young woman in her 30s stood. She looked terrified, but she stood tall. Sarah teaches history. She's been doing it for 8 years. She's a Jewish woman who believes in the American dream. But after you tweeted that support for Israel was all about the Benjamins, suggesting that Jewish money was the only reason America supports its allies, Sarah's life changed. Sarah took the microphone, her voice trembling. I went to school that Monday and saw the swastika. Underneath it, someone had written, Omar told us the truth about you. My students, kids I love, started asking me if I was a traitor. I had to take 3 months of medical leave. I was afraid to walk to my car. I stopped wearing my grandmother's Star of David necklace, the one she wore through the Holocaust, because I was afraid in my own city. Kennedy slammed the photo onto Omar's desk. A Star of David hidden in America. Because of your words, You didn't just criticize a government. You dog-whistled to every bigot in the country. You told the world that Jewish people are disloyal, and Sarah Goldstein paid the price in red paint and death threats. I am not responsible for the actions of fringe extremists, Omar stated coldly. When you're a member of Congress, you're responsible for the fire you light, Kennedy countered. You lit the match. Sarah felt the burn. And you haven't even had the decency to apologize to her. Not really. Just those, "I'm sorry you were offended" apologies that aren't worth the paper they're printed on. Sarah sat down, clutching the necklace she was now wearing proudly. Omar was shaking not with sadness, but with a visible, vibrating rage that was being caught by every high-definition camera in the room. This continues the narrative of the Louisiana lesson, picking up immediately after the confrontation regarding Sarah Goldstein. Chapter 5. Captain Brady and the Weight of Granite. The silence in the chamber following Sarah Goldstein's testimony was heavy, the kind that settles in a church after a particularly harrowing eulogy. Kennedy let it stretch. Let the image of that hidden Star of David burn into the minds of the millions watching. Then he shifted gears. The sorrow evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard solemnity. "We need to talk about memory, Congresswoman," Kennedy said, his voice dropping an octave. "We need to talk about the day the world changed. September 11th, he didn't open a folder this time. He just rested his hands on the table and looked at a man sitting in the very last row. Captain Thomas Brady, FDNY, retired. Please stand up, sir." A man in his late 50s rose. He was wearing his dress blue uniform, the brass buttons gleaming under the television lights. His face looked like it had been chiseled out of granite, hard, weathered, and utterly unmovable. He stood at a perfect military attention that he hadn't used in years, but that his body remembered instantly. Captain Brady was with Ladder Company 15 inches lower Manhattan on that Tuesday morning, Kennedy said softly. He was one of the first responders to the South Tower. He spent 3 weeks on the pile at Ground Zero, breathing in dust that Congress is still fighting over paying medical bills for. Kennedy paused, letting the weight of that service sink in. Captain Brady lost 16 men from his firehouse that day. 16 brothers. And he lost his actual brother, Deputy Chief Daniel Brady, who was last seen heading up the stairs of the North Tower on the 40th floor while everyone else was running down. Kennedy turned to Omar. The disgust on his face was no longer masked by folksy charm. "And a few years ago, at a fundraiser for a special interest group, you described that day, the day Captain Brady's brother was vaporized, the day 3,000 Americans were murdered on live television, as some people did something." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. It wasn't anger this time. It was horror. Kennedy walked away from the table and stood next to Captain Brady. The contrast was stark. The Southern lawyer in his expensive suit and the New York firefighter in his uniform of service. "Captain," Kennedy said, "would you like to tell the Congresswoman what 'some people did something' feels like to you?" Captain Brady didn't look at Kennedy. He looked straight ahead, his eyes fixed on a point 1,000 yards away. When he spoke, his voice was gravel, rough, deep, and resonant. "My brother Danny had 3 kids. The youngest was 6 months old. They found his helmet 2 blocks away. They never found Danny." He stopped. His jaw worked, grinding back and forth. "We didn't find something in the rubble, Congresswoman. We found pieces of our friends. We found wedding rings attached to fingers. We found wallets with pictures of kids who were orphans before lunch. It wasn't some people. It was terrorists. It wasn't something. It was an act of war against my city and my family." He finally turned his eyes to Omar. They were dry, but they burned with a cold intensity that made her shrink back in her chair. "You sit in the capital of the United States. You took an oath to protect this country. and you minimized the greatest tragedy in our modern history to a throwaway line to get applause at a banquet. You spit on my brother's grave to score a political point. Kennedy put a hand gently on Brady's shoulder, then turned to Omar. Well, do you have anything to say to the captain? Any context you'd like to add? Omar opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape hatch that didn't exist. For the first time all day, she looked small. Captain Brady shook his head slowly. Don't bother, Senator. She doesn't have the words. People like her never do when they have to face the wreckage they leave behind. He sat down, his spine still steel straight. The room remained dead silent. No one dared to clap. It was too sacred a moment for applause. Chapter 6. James Morrison and the Broken Key. Kennedy walked back to his seat, his movements heavier now. The emotional toll of the hearing was beginning to show on everyone, but he wasn't finished. There was one more piece of the puzzle. We've talked about the past, Kennedy said, organizing his papers one last time. Let's talk about the present. Let's talk about the economy you say you want to build. He signaled to the middle section of the gallery. James Morrison, come on down here, son. A man in his late 40s walked down the aisle. He looked defeated. His shoulders were slumped, his jacket was frayed at the cuffs, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept through the night in months. Kennedy met him halfway and guided him to a small table set up near the witness stand, placing him directly in Omar's line of sight. James here owned a hardware store in Minneapolis, Kennedy said. Morrison's Hardware. It was on Lake Street. James, tell the folks how long that store was there. James cleared his throat. His voice was quiet, trembling slightly. My grandfather opened it in 1958. My dad ran it for 30 years. I took over in 2010. We survived recessions, big box stores, everything. We were part of the neighborhood. I sponsored the Little League team. And what happened last summer, James? Kennedy asked gently. James took a shaky breath. There were protests, then riots. It got bad fast. The congresswoman, she gave speeches. She talked about tearing down the system, about how businesses were exploiters, about how the revolution was necessary. He looked down at his hands, calloused from years of honest work. They came on a Thursday night. They broke the windows first. Then they came inside. They smashed everything. Paint aisles, power tools, the registers. They set a fire in the back office. By the time the fire department got there, they were delayed because people were throwing bricks at the trucks. It was gone. 60 years of my family's life, gone in 2 hours. Kennedy leaned forward. Did you have insurance, James? Yeah. But the clause for civil unrest had a massive deductible. And the city. The city didn't stop it. They let it burn because they didn't want to upset the people you were encouraging. James looked at Omar now, his eyes filling with tears of frustration. I employed 12 people from that neighborhood. Good people. They all lost their jobs. I lost everything. My savings, my kids' college fund. It was all tied up in that store. Kennedy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished brass key. He laid it on the table in front of James. What's this, James? James stared at the key. A single tear rolled down his cheek, tracking through the stubble on his face. That's the front door key. It's all I have left. The bank foreclosed on the lot last month. It's just dirt now. Kennedy picked up the key. It looked impossibly small in his large hand. He held it up. This is your revolution, Congresswoman, Kennedy said, his voice laced with venom. It's not glorious. It's not poetic. It's a broken man holding a key to a door that doesn't exist anymore. You stoked the anger. You told people that destruction was justice. And while you were safe in your secure condo in D.C., James was watching his grandfather's legacy burn to the ground on the nightly news. He dropped the key onto the table in front of Omar. It hit the wood with a sharp clink that sounded like a prison cell door slamming shut. "You keep that," Kennedy said. "Put it on your desk, next to your awards. Let it remind you of the real-world cost of your cheap rhetoric." Omar stared at the key. She didn't touch it. Her hands were trembling uncontrollably now. The facade was gone. There was nothing left but the wreckage. Chapter 7. The avalanche begins. Kennedy sat back. He was done. He looked at the 5 victims scattered around the gallery: Betty, Mohammed, Sarah, Captain Brady, James, a mosaic of American life, all damaged by the same source. "I have no further questions for this witness," Kennedy said quietly. The room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a catharsis, a standing ovation that started in the back rows with the general public and swept forward like a tidal wave, consuming the press corps, the staffers, and finally, many of the committee members themselves. It was a wall of sound, a physical rejection of everything Ilhan Omar stood for in that moment. Omar sat alone at the table, surrounded by the noise, looking small and utterly defeated. Her staff had already begun to slip out the side doors, phones pressed to their ears, abandoned ship protocols already initiated. Kennedy stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the room without looking back. He didn't need to see the end. He knew what happened next. The avalanche started before he even reached the hallway. Within minutes, the clips were online. Not the edited sound bites the cable news networks usually preferred, but raw, 5-minute chunks of devastation. Betty's trembling hand holding the mic. Amina sobbing into her father's shoulder. Captain Brady's stone-cold refusal to engage. The sound of James Morrison's key hitting the table. It went supernova. The Louisiana lesson trended globally within the hour. 47 million views in the first day. It was undeniable. It was visceral. It was the kind of political violence that leaves no room for spin. By 5 p.m., the first rats were fleeing the ship. 2 major corporate donors issued statements suspending their contributions, pending a full review. By 7 p.m., Omar's chief of staff resigned via a terse statement on Twitter, citing fundamental differences in values. But the most damning thing was the silence. Where was the squad? Where were the firebrand defenders who usually leaped to her aid on social media within seconds of any criticism? Their feeds were dark. AOC tweeted something vague about the importance of listening. A coward's way of saying nothing at all. The Democratic leadership was nowhere to be found. No press conferences in her defense. No talking points sent to surrogates. They knew. Everyone knew. Ilhan Omar was radioactive. Kennedy watched it all from a bar stool in Georgetown, nursing a bourbon. He wasn't celebrating. There was no joy in seeing the damage that had been done to those 5 people. But there was satisfaction. The grim satisfaction of a simple country lawyer who had finally brought the truth to town. The dam had broken, and the flood was just beginning. Chapter 8. In the weeks following the hearing, the city of Minneapolis became the epicenter of a political earthquake. The 5th District, once considered a fortress for the progressive revolution, was now a landscape of doubt and quiet betrayal. Ilhan Omar didn't resign. To do so would be to admit defeat, and her brand was built on defiance. But she became a ghost. In the halls of Congress, she walked through corridors where colleagues suddenly found interest in their smartphones as she approached. In her home district, the vibrant, cheering crowds that once greeted her were replaced by small, somber gatherings and an army of protesters holding signs that simply read, "Where is Betty's $50?" Her primary challenger, a moderate with deep roots in the community, didn't have to do much. He simply stood in front of the charred remains of James Morrison's hardware store and spoke about accountability. He didn't need to attack her. John Kennedy had already done the demolition work. He just had to offer a way out of the wreckage. The polling was a slow-motion car crash. On Monday, she was down 5 points. By Friday, following a viral interview where Betty Henderson told her story on a major network, the gap widened to 12. By the time the final Louisiana lesson video reached 100 million views, the pollsters recorded a staggering 19-point deficit. The squad remained silent. Their silence was the loudest sound in Washington. They had seen the receipts. They had seen the faces of Sarah, Mohammed, and Captain Brady. To defend Omar was to declare war on a retired nurse, a grieving firefighter, and a Jewish teacher. Not even the most radical activists were willing to pay that price. On election night, the atmosphere in Omar's campaign headquarters was that of a wake. The music was low, the pizza was cold, and the giant screens showed the inevitable numbers. At 9:45 p.m., the race was called. She hadn't just lost. She had been repudiated. Her concession speech lasted exactly 2 minutes. She spoke of dark money and orchestrated attacks, but the fire was gone. As she walked off the stage, the cameras caught her looking down at the small brass key James Morrison had left on her table. She didn't take it with her. She left it on the podium, a small, cold piece of metal that had cost her a career. Chapter 9. The Resurrection of Lake Street. While a political career was dying, something else was being born. The GoFundMe campaign, started by viewers of the hearing, didn't just meet its goal, it shattered it. Within 3 months, James Morrison wasn't just planning a reopening, he was building a flagship. The new store, located 2 blocks from the old site, was rebranded with a name that had become a symbol of justice: Kennedy's Hardware, a Morrison family legacy. On the day of the grand opening, the line of customers stretched for 6 blocks. They weren't just there for hammers and nails. They were there to witness a resurrection. Senator John Kennedy himself flew up for the ribbon cutting. He stood on a makeshift stage, his trademark Louisiana smile bright against the Minnesota sky. "I'm just a simple country lawyer," he told the cheering crowd. "But I know that when a good man is knocked down, you don't just help him up. You give him the tools to build a bigger house." Inside the store, Maria Rodriguez was back behind the counter. But this time, she was a part owner. Her 3 children were in the back office doing their homework, their college funds fully vested by an anonymous donor who many suspected wore a certain kind of Southern tie. In Duluth, Betty Henderson became the neighborhood's most famous resident. She didn't keep a dime of the money sent to her by supporters. She donated it all to a scholarship fund for young nurses. Every Sunday, she would sit on her porch, and neighbors would stop by to say, "Thanks for being brave, Betty." She would just smile and say, "I just wanted to make sure the truth didn't get lost in the mail." Sarah Goldstein returned to teaching, but not at the high school where the paint had scarred the doors. She became the director of a national program called Grandmother's Necklace, dedicated to teaching teenagers about the Holocaust and the power of civic courage. She wore her grandmother's Star of David every single day, no longer hidden, but gleaming with a light that no amount of red paint could ever dim. Mohammed Hassan and his daughter, Amina, finally had their 12 years of lost time recognized. Under the Mohammed Hassan Act, the legal immigration system was overhauled to prioritize those who followed the rules, ensuring that no father would ever again have to be a stranger on the phone to his child. On the day he took his oath as a citizen, Mohammed looked at the American flag and whispered, "I followed the rules, and the rules finally remembered me." Chapter 10. The Sound of the White House. The hearing didn't just end a career, it launched a movement. John Kennedy's performance had tapped into a deep, dormant hunger in the American soul, a hunger for accountability that wasn't partisan, but moral. 4 years later, The Louisiana lesson went from a committee room to the national stage. Kennedy ran for the presidency not on a platform of complex white papers, but on a platform of simple questions. His campaign rallies were unlike anything the country had seen. He didn't use teleprompters. He just told stories. He talked about Betty. He talked about James. He talked about the difference between some people and heroes. He won in a landslide. For 8 years, the sound of the White House was a slow, rhythmic Louisiana drawl. He didn't pass omnibus bills that no one read. He passed the Betty Henderson Transparency Act. He didn't hold summits with dictators. He held town halls with people who felt forgotten. His legacy wasn't built on concrete or steel, but on the restoration of a simple truth, that, in America, the person who pays the bill is the one who should be served, and the person who holds the power is the one who must answer the questions. Epilogue. The Tombstone in Baton Rouge. When John Kennedy finally passed away at the age of 88, the funeral was the largest in the history of Louisiana. Presidents, kings, and celebrities were there, but the front rows were reserved for a different kind of royalty. The grandchildren of James Morrison were there. Amina Hassan, now a federal judge, was there. Sarah Goldstein, an old woman herself now, stood by the casket and laid a small Star of David charm on the velvet. Kennedy's tombstone in Baton Rouge was simple, as he had requested. It didn't list his titles or his awards. It simply read, John Kennedy. He asked the questions. He delivered the justice. He never forgot Betty. As the sun set over the Mississippi River, the last of the mourners lingered. A young law student, inspired by the stories he'd heard, stood before the grave. He held a small brass key in his hand, a replica of the one James Morrison had once used to break a congresswoman's heart. He left the key on the headstone. He knew that somewhere, in some committee room or some back alley office, someone was getting too comfortable, too corrupt, or too careless. And he knew that as long as people remembered the Louisiana lesson, there would always be someone brave enough to stand up, lean forward, and ask, "Now, I don't mean any disrespect, but I have a simple question." The end.